What happens when the maid everyone ignored becomes the heir? Who owns it all? Stay tuned, because the biggest secret of the Kingston family is about to explode. Angela Dawson was only 26, yet her life had been a journey of endless sacrifice. She had grown up in the crowded lanes of Kumasi, raised by a single mother who passed away when she was barely in her teens. With no family to turn to, Angela had learned early that survival demanded both humility and strength. Now, she worked as a maid in the Kingston mansion, one of the grandest homes in Accra, a place where marble floors gleamed like mirrors and crystal chandeliers dripped luxury from the ceilings. Every morning before dawn, Angela's day began. She swept the long corridors of polished wood, polished the brass handles on giant oak doors, and scrubbed the tiled fountains until her back ached. The mansion was a world of glittering wealth, yet Angela lived in a small servants' quarter at the far end of the compound, her room no bigger than a storehouse. While she worked tirelessly, the other staff treated her with disdain. Some whispered that she was too quiet, too reserved, as if she carried secrets no one could touch. Others mocked her, calling her the invisible maid because she rarely defended herself against insults. But Angela had something the rest did not know. Beneath her thin mattress, hidden in an old wooden trunk, lay a sealed envelope she had kept for years. It was the last gift from her late mother, the only relic she had left of her. Angela had never opened it. She told herself she was not ready, that whatever secret it contained might change her world forever. So she buried herself in silence, working harder than anyone else in the mansion, trying to avoid notice. The Kingston family, however, noticed her every day. Daniel Kingston, the owner of the mansion, was a man of power and authority. At 52, he commanded respect in business circles across Ghana. He rarely spoke to his staff, but his presence filled every room like the weight of iron. His only daughter, Vanessa Kingston, was the opposite, a spoiled, arrogant young woman in her mid-20s who wore her wealth like a crown. She looked down on Angela with contempt, mocking her behind closed doors, treating her like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. On the surface, Angela appeared unaffected. She lowered her head whenever Vanessa lashed out, cleaned every corner of the mansion as though her life depended on it, and never answered back. But deep inside, she carried the sting of humiliation. Every insult added to the quiet fire building in her chest. She often wondered if life would ever change for her, or if she was destined to remain a shadow in someone else's story. The mansion itself seemed to remind her of what she lacked. The high walls guarded a life she could never claim, a world of privilege she could only observe from the corners of her eyes. Guests arrived in luxury cars. Laughter echoed from cocktail parties, and perfumes of the wealthy lingered in the air long after the gatherings were done. Angela would stand silently at the edge of the hall, holding trays, watching the elegance unfold like a distant dream. And yet, whenever Daniel Kingston's gaze fell upon her, something peculiar stirred. He looked at Angela not just as a servant, but with a strange intensity, as though he was trying to read something in her face, something familiar. Angela noticed it, but chose to ignore it. She assumed it was her imagination, another trick of her weary mind. But she could not ignore the envelope hidden in her trunk. Some nights, when the compound was quiet and the hum of Accra's traffic had faded into the distance, she would sit on her bed and hold it in her hands. The wax seal was still unbroken, the handwriting of her late mother staring back at her. She wondered if it contained blessings, confessions, or instructions. The weight of it pressed heavily on her soul. She told herself that one day she would be brave enough to open it. One day she would face whatever truth her mother had left behind. What Angela did not know was that the letter carried the power to flip her world upside down. What she did not know was that the mansion she worked in, the family she served, and the insults she endured were all threads in a larger story, one she was about to inherit without even realizing. And so, Chapter 1 closed on Angela standing quietly in the Kingston mansion's long corridor, her broom resting against the wall, her eyes lifted briefly to the grand family portrait that hung above the staircase. She had no idea that her own name belonged in that legacy, and that her life as just a maid was about to collide with a destiny greater than she could ever imagine. The Kingston mansion glittered that evening under golden lights, preparing for one of Daniel Kingston's most important banquets. Business leaders, politicians, and wealthy socialites from all over Accra were invited. The staff scurried about, polishing wine glasses, arranging cutlery, and setting the long dining table that stretched beneath a crystal chandelier. The air carried the mingled scents of roasted lamb, jollof rice, and freshly baked bread. It was an evening of glamour, and the family wanted perfection. Angela, dressed in her plain maid's uniform, moved silently from room to room, carrying trays, pouring wine, and ensuring that every guest was comfortable. She worked with the precision of someone who understood that any mistake could cost her dearly. To her, this was not just a job, it was survival. But to Vanessa Kingston, Angela was nothing more than a nuisance. Vanessa floated around the banquet hall like a queen, her sequined gown catching the light as she laughed with guests. Yet every time her eyes fell on Angela, her laughter sharpened into scorn. It was as if Angela's very presence threatened her sense of superiority. As the evening unfolded, Vanessa seized the opportunity to humiliate Angela in front of the guests. With a cruel smirk, she gestured toward Angela, spilling wine across the polished floor and onto Angela's neatly pressed uniform. Gasps rose from some of the onlookers, but most simply pretended not to notice. In Vanessa's world, such cruelty was entertainment. Angela stood still, her heart pounding, the crimson stain spreading across her clothing. She wanted to disappear into the walls, to vanish before the laughter grew louder. She bent down to clean the spill, her fingers trembling, her face hot with shame. And yet, as she crouched on the marble floor, something shifted. Her eyes caught Daniel Kingston's across the hall. Daniel had been standing among his business partners, his glass of champagne untouched. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered on Angela. It wasn't pity, nor was it anger. It was something far deeper, almost as though he recognized a part of her that no one else could see. His stare unsettled Angela. She quickly lowered her head, hiding her face, unsure of what to make of it. Later that night, long after the banquet ended and laughter had faded into silence, Angela sat alone outside the servants' quarters. The harmattan wind swept across the compound, carrying dust and cold through the trees. Her stained uniform still clung to her skin, and the sting of humiliation burned inside her chest. For years she had endured this life, swallowing her pride, hiding her pain, and working harder than anyone else, yet the mockery never ended. But this night felt different. Something inside her refused to remain buried. The humiliation cracked open an old wound, and her thoughts drifted back to the envelope hidden beneath her mattress. For years she had resisted it, too afraid to face the truth sealed in wax. But now, as the moonlight cast a pale glow over the compound, she felt she could no longer wait. Angela walked back into her small room, her hands trembling as she pulled the wooden trunk from beneath her bed. She opened it slowly, the old hinges groaning as if they knew the weight of the secret within. And there it was, the envelope, untouched, just as her mother had left it. She sat on the bed, her heart hammering as she stared at the handwriting she knew so well. With a deep breath, she broke the seal. The paper crackled as she unfolded the letter. Her mother's words spilled across the page, written with urgency, with love, and with a hidden truth. Angela's eyes moved quickly, each line stealing the breath from her lungs. The truth struck like lightning. Her mother revealed that years ago she had worked for the Kingston family, not just as a servant, but as a woman who had captured the attention of the Kingston patriarch, Daniel's late father. From that connection came not just whispered secrets, but an inheritance meant to secure Angela's future. A fortune had been set aside, hidden from the greedy hands of those who would misuse it. And Angela, as her only child, was the rightful heir. The letter went further. It hinted at betrayal, at truths buried beneath wealth and silence. It warned Angela to be cautious, for powerful people might have kept her in the shadows deliberately. And above all, it urged her not to be afraid, because destiny, no matter how delayed, could not be erased. Angela sat frozen on her bed, the letter trembling in her hands. The mansion outside was quiet, but inside her mind, the walls shook with revelation. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her life, and her place in the world had been torn apart in an instant. Her heart pounded with fear, but also with something new, something dangerous. For the first time, Angela felt the stirrings of power. She was no ordinary maid. She was heir to a legacy, And though she could not yet see how, she knew her life in the Kingston mansion would never be the same again. Angela barely slept that night. The words of her late mother's letter replayed in her mind like echoes in a dark room. She turned on her bed again and again, clutching the letter to her chest, wondering if it was real or if her mother had written it out of fear and desperation. But the handwriting was her mother's, and the seal was authentic. Somewhere, hidden in the folds of Ghana's wealthy history, Angela's destiny had been written long before she was born. By sunrise, she knew she needed proof. She could not carry such a secret alone. So she made a bold decision to find Mr. Alfred Grant, her mother's trusted friend and lawyer, the only man her mother had named in the letter. Alfred Grant was no ordinary lawyer. He was a man in his early 60s, known in Accra for his integrity, a rare figure in a world often tainted by corruption. His office was tucked between the bustling streets of OSU, surrounded by the noise of traffic, hawkers, and the vibrant life of the city. Angela arrived quietly, her plain dress blending her into the crowd, yet her heart raced with a storm of anticipation. Inside the dim office lined with dusty files and wooden cabinets, Alfred welcomed her with a heavy gaze, as if he already knew why she had come. Angela placed the letter before him with trembling hands. Alfred read every line carefully, his expression tightening as the truth unfolded again before his eyes. When he finally leaned back in his chair, his silence spoke louder than words. He confirmed everything. Her mother had indeed been named in a private will by Daniel Kingston's father. The old man, before his death, had left behind not only money but also shares in companies and properties in Kumasi and Accra. These assets had been hidden deliberately, meant to be passed down quietly to Angela's mother and, after her, to Angela herself. But here was the twist. Alfred revealed that Daniel Kingston was not ignorant of this truth. He had known for years. In fact, he had ensured that the matter was buried, convincing the family that Angela's mother's claim was invalid. Daniel had allowed Angela to live her life in obscurity, to serve in his mansion as a maid, while knowing all along that she was the rightful heir to a fortune that rivaled his own. The revelation hit Angela like a heavy storm. She felt betrayed, not only by fate but by the man she had served with such humility. Every time Daniel's eyes lingered on her, every time he watched her in silence, it had not been confusion, it had been recognition. He had known the truth but chosen to keep her in the shadows, beneath his roof, where she would remain powerless. As Alfred explained further, Angela's destiny became clear. The inheritance was still hers to claim. The law was on her side, and the documents her mother had entrusted to Alfred years ago were intact. All Angela had to do was step forward and demand what was rightfully hers. But fear clashed with courage in her heart. To challenge Daniel Kingston was to challenge one of the most powerful men in Ghana. He had influence, wealth, and allies who would protect him at all costs. Angela was just a maid in the eyes of the world. Who would believe her? Who would fight for her? And yet, she could not deny the truth burning inside her. Her mother had trusted her with this legacy, had suffered in silence so that Angela might one day rise. The thought of walking back into the mansion, serving food and sweeping floors while knowing she was the rightful heir, filled her with both rage and determination. As she left Alfred's office and stepped back into the noisy streets of Accra, the city seemed different. The honking trotro buses, the voices of hawkers selling plantain chips and bottled water, the chatter of strangers rushing to work, all of it seemed to remind her of the life she had been forced to accept. But now she carried a new truth, one that could change everything. Angela knew Daniel Kingston's silence was not a mistake. It was a deliberate act to keep her from claiming her place. The mansion, the empire, the wealth, none of it truly belonged to Vanessa or Daniel. It was hers. And as the evening sun dipped low over the city, Angela made a quiet promise to herself. She would not remain hidden forever. The time would come when she would stand tall, when the world would know that the maid of the Kingston mansion was more than a servant. She was the rightful heir. And when that day came, nothing in Ghana would remain the same. The Kingston mansion had always been a place of silence for Angela, a place where her presence blended into the walls, where she swept floors and polished glass without leaving a trace. But this time, when she walked through the heavy wooden doors, she carried herself differently. She was no longer just a maid. She was the woman holding proof of a legacy, armed with documents and a name that could shake the very foundation of the empire she served. That evening, Daniel Kingston sat alone in his study, the air thick with the smell of aged whiskey and cigar smoke. His mahogany desk gleamed under the soft glow of a golden lamp, piles of papers neatly arranged before him. The room was decorated with portraits of the Kingston lineage, men who had built and guarded wealth for generations. Daniel had always believed himself to be the rightful custodian of that legacy. But the moment Angela placed her mother's letter and Alfred Grant's legal documents on his desk, the balance of power shifted. Daniel's silence stretched across the room like a blade. He picked up the papers slowly, scanning the familiar handwriting, the legal seals, the signatures he thought he had buried forever. His face, usually unreadable, cracked with flickers of recognition and unease. He had known this day might come. He had feared it in secret, even as he told himself the truth would remain hidden. Angela stood before him, not as a maid awaiting instructions, but as a woman demanding acknowledgement. The quiet humility that had defined her melted into something sharper, resolve. Though her hands trembled slightly, her eyes held steady. She would not bow. She would not retreat. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his mind racing. For decades, he had held the empire together, building upon his father's foundations, expanding properties across Ghana, ensuring the Kingston name commanded respect in Accra and Kumasi alike. And now, this woman, this servant, threatened to strip it all away. But Angela was no longer afraid. With Alfred Grant's guidance, she had already taken the first steps to secure her claim. Legal petitions had been filed. Documents had been verified. The inheritance was no longer a hidden secret whispered in shadows. It was a truth on the brink of exploding into the public domain. News traveled quickly. Within days, whispers began circulating in elite circles of Accra. The maid of the Kingston mansion is more than she seems. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others leaned in with curiosity, hungry for scandal. And soon, headlines began to surface, stories painting Angela as the forgotten heir. The household staff, who once mocked her, now watched her with a new mixture of fear and awe. They offered to serve her food, to carry her load, to flatter her in hopes of favor. The same corridors where she had once moved unseen now buzzed with her name. Vanessa, however, erupted with fury. To her, Angela's claim was an insult, a direct attack on her position as the daughter of the empire. She stormed through the mansion like a raging storm, her voice echoing off the marble walls as she vowed never to accept Angela as her equal. To Vanessa, Angela would always remain the maid, no matter what papers or lawyers claimed otherwise. But the tide of power was already shifting. Angela's name appeared in official documents. Meetings were scheduled with company board members. Lawyers prepared to review the Kingston estate in full. The more Vanessa screamed, the more powerless she appeared. The world beyond the mansion was no longer laughing at Angela. They were watching her, waiting to see how the forgotten maid would rise. And Daniel, though he still carried the weight of authority, could feel his grip loosening. The empire he had once controlled with iron hands was slipping, and the servant he had kept in silence was the one pulling it from beneath him. Angela knew the path ahead would not be easy. She was challenging not only a powerful man, but also the perception of an entire society that measured worth by status and wealth. Yet as she stood by the window of her small servant's room that night, staring out at the lights of Accra, she felt no fear. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of destiny pressing on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a crown. The maid was no longer invisible. She was the heir, and the world would soon have no choice but to recognize her. The grand inheritance ceremony was held in Kumasi, inside the Kingston Ancestral mansion, a sprawling estate of red clay roofs, carved wooden pillars, and lush gardens that whispered of generations of wealth and secrets. The air was thick with anticipation. Journalists filled the courtyard, cameras flashing. Lawyers and board members sat in neat rows, papers stacked before them. Relatives and society figures leaned forward, eager to witness the scandal that had rocked one of Ghana's most powerful families. Angela entered the hall slowly, dressed in a simple but elegant cream gown. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face calm though her heart thundered inside her chest. Only weeks ago, she had walked these halls as a servant, unseen and dismissed. Now, All eyes followed her as she took her place at the front, her presence commanding silence. Daniel Kingston sat rigid at the opposite side of the hall, his once confident shoulders heavy with dread. He had fought to suppress this day, but the law and truth had cornered him. Vanessa sat beside him, her face twisted with rage, her glittering dress a mask for the storm brewing inside her. To her, this ceremony was nothing short of betrayal. The chief lawyer, Alfred Grant, stood tall as he began reading aloud the final will of the late Kingston patriarch. His voice echoed across the hall, steady and deliberate. The words struck like thunder: shares, properties, lands, and financial accounts. All of it named under Angela's late mother, and by direct inheritance, transferred fully to Angela Dawson. Gasps rippled through the hall. Murmurs rose. Some clapped discreetly in approval, others whispered in disbelief. Angela remained still, her hands folded neatly, her face a mask of quiet strength. But Alfred was not finished. His next words carried the twist that would shatter the Kingston legacy forever. He revealed documents, private letters, and testimonies long buried. The truth was undeniable. Angela's mother had not just been a servant in the Kingston household. She had been the secret lover of the patriarch himself. From that relationship came Angela. Angela was not only an heir, she was the legitimate bloodline of the Kingston family. Daniel Kingston, who had ruled the empire for decades, was not just her oppressor. He was her half-brother. The revelation fell upon the hall like a storm. Gasps turned into shouts, the weight of scandal electrifying the crowd. Daniel's face drained of color as the truth settled on his shoulders. His empire was not only slipping away, it had never been fully his. The rightful heir had been under his roof all along, cleaning his floors, serving his meals, and enduring his silence. Vanessa, unable to contain her fury, rose and stormed out of the hall, her heels striking the marble with rage. To her, the humiliation was unbearable. But Daniel could not move. He sat frozen, staring at the floor, his entire life dismantled in a single moment. Angela, however, did not gloat. She rose to her feet with grace, her voice steady as she addressed the hall. She declared that she would not tear down the Kingston Empire but rebuild it, not with arrogance or cruelty, but with dignity, respect, and justice. She vowed to honor her late mother's memory by turning the empire into something that served not just the wealthy, but the people of Ghana. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. The same society that had once mocked her now rose in admiration. Angela Dawson, the maid who had lived in silence, had risen into her destiny. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a servant. She was Angela Kingston, the rightful heir, the woman who had turned humiliation into triumph. And as she stepped out into the bright Kumasi sun, the cameras flashing all around her, she felt the weight of her past fall away. The maid had become a queen in her own right. Her story, once buried in shadows, had ended in the light. For Angela, everything had changed. And for Ghana, her name would be remembered forever. The end. Angela was once invisible. Now she is unstoppable. But what happens when new enemies rise from the shadows? Don't miss what's coming. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and be the first to witness the next twist.